Games like cornhole and bocce and cube, they're just not my thing. And darts, I'm terrible at darts. Duck and cover, my friend, if you see me with a dart in my hand. I'm just not very good at dexterity games, even if they're adapted to the tabletop. Just flicking and tossing and rolling and any of those games, just really bad. But regardless of that, I found myself going down a very interesting rabbit hole recently. Games about bowling. A simple Wikipedia search brings up the following information about bowling. 10-pin bowling, 9-pin bowling, 5-pin bowling, duck pin bowling, candle pin bowling, trick bowling, which sounds a lot like putt-putt golf, not to be confused with bowls, aka lawn bowling, bocce. There's something called Irish road bowling, which is sort of like a relay race, but you're rolling balls down the road. There's also something called feather bowling, which is like curling, except no ice, which I would suspect is very much like puck bowling, shuffleboard with pins. Skittles, with various different names, is a very old game and kind of bowling related in that you're knocking stuff down with a ball, but the ball is suspended. And despite products like this, that use the word bowl. Is it Skittles or is it bowling? It's Skittles. Knocking down pins with balls is first mentioned in the 13th century in writing in the West, but it is very, very much older than that. I can even imagine cave dwellers throwing rocks and knocking stuff over. Behold, I am best rock thrower in whole tribe. The tossing of rocks actually evolved into a real sport, with rules and everything. Archaeologists have unearthed artifacts from Egypt, which are obviously bowling pins and bowling balls that are 7,000 years old. The Germanic tribes were playing bowling games when the Roman Empire first encountered them, around the year 300. It was also popular in Rome, basically learned from the barbarians at the gate. Now, bowling 9 pins was really popular back in the 13th and 14th centuries. And in 1361, King Edward III of England banned bowling entirely. Of course he did. They're always banning stuff that's fun. But the sport eventually reasserted itself and became popular again. It's said that King Henry VIII was an avid bowler, and he banned bowling as well, but only for the hoi polloi. The aristocracy was still allowed to bowl, and to police that, he imposed a tax on bowling alleys, so only the rich could afford to bowl. In 1606, Thomas Dekker wrote about bowling in a book called The 7 Deadly Sins of London. He wrote, quote, "Sloth gave orders that dicing houses and bowling alleys should be erected, whereupon a number of poor handicraftsmen, who before wrought night and day, never took care for a good day's work afterwards." Well, the European colonists brought bowling to the Americas. Of course they did. And because 9 pins, the most popular form of bowling, had been declared illegal, they invented 10 pins. Of course they did. It was a simple way to get around the 9 pins ban. Well, this proved to be a very, very popular form of the sport, and it evolved further through the ensuing century, so the form of bowling we're familiar with today was beginning to take root in the middle of the Victorian era. Bowling alleys were being set up in pubs and public places, private clubs and public gymnasiums, even the YMCA. And our modern game of 10 pins in the USA was codified by the American Bowling Congress in New York City in 1895. With those standardized rules, people's competitive nature was inspired, and there began to be leagues and tournaments and championships all over the country. Now, in addition to those full-size bowling alleys, with their pin setter staff and their mechanical ball returns, There was a host of different smaller miniaturized versions, similar to what I've got on the table here. This set of 10 pins was created back in the 1930s. It was made to be played with in the hallway at home. Well, here's where that rabbit hole gets really deep. There are 67 games listed on the Board Game Geek website that have the word bowling in their name. They're mostly dice games or dexterity games, of course. In 2004, the 11th edition of the Catalog of Games from the International Association of Games and Puzzles lists 116 bowling games. And again, the vast majority of them are sets of pins and balls. There were alleys of various kinds, strips of cloth, vinyl, metal, wood, you name it, including, of course, gutters. And bowling games with projectiles other than balls, and bowling games with pins other than wooden pins. Well, it became evident very quickly that this rabbit hole's way too deep. So I decided I had to pare it down to something that would fit into my normal format here on the channel. The earliest commercially produced bowling game I found was in 1896. I couldn't find a photo of it, but the description that I found on BGG does sound like a board game. It says, perhaps the earliest bowling board game, this game's box features a woman bowling while wearing a dress. The board is a grid of 48 squares with various numbers of pins, spares, strikes, or fouls listed. And that's about all anybody knows about this game. I found that exact same quote on other research sites about board games, so it appears it's kind of a dead end. But hidden somewhere in a museum's back room, there may be a copy. Sometime around that same era, there was a game called Scarb, and that was produced in New York City by a guy named Ira Mansorge. It was a tabletop bowling game, but there weren't any pins, and it was more like a skee ball type of an arrangement. In 1904, the Parker brothers came out with a bowling game that was in the same box as a Tiddlywinks game. And in order to do the bowling version, you covered that Tiddlywinks cup with a disc, and then in the center of that disc was a large pin, and around that were 9 smaller pins. And you use your tiddlywinks to try to knock the pins over. That's some pretty forceful tiddlywinking, I would think. There were a few attempts at doing bowling games with cards and dice at the time, but they weren't very successful until 1940, when the granddaddy of all bowling games made its debut. This is my copy of the 1940 edition of Spare Time Bowling. Let me show you what's in the box. In later years, this little plastic bowling pin became red and white. This is really heavy wood top and a Bakelite or some other plastic bottom, and teeny tiny little dice. Now those particular dice had 5 blank sides and one side with a pin depicted on it. And then one of the dice had a side opposite the pin that had a spare symbol. That pattern would be repeated for decades afterwards. And the basic gameplay included rolling those dice twice. And then you would add up the blank sides. That meant that the pin was down. And then record your score on a regular bowling score sheet. It was instantly popular, and I found this a special edition of Spare Time Bowling published for the Hastings Kismet Company. In 1950, the Spare Time Bowling was licensed to the Shaper Company, and after they'd manufactured it for a while, the license was bought by Lakeside Toys. The Spare Time brand was still around until 1964. Lakeside started phasing it out at that point. For more on the Lakeside company, check out my video about Kismet. But it looks like 1977 was the last Lakeside edition of Spare Time Bowling. Later on, the license was picked up by Binary Arts Company, and they changed their name in 2001 to Think Fun. And according to what I could find, they published Spare Time Bowling until 2003. Well, I called it the granddaddy of all bowling games because it was imitated so many times by so many knockoffs. There were a lot of those competing products that changed the rules a little bit. Some added strike dice or more spare dice or fewer dice that had to be rolled more often. One of the earliest competitors was a game called Galloping Bowling by a company called Galloping Games. That game's pretty rare now. They used 5 Bakelite dice, and they're the ones that had the strike and spare and a pickup die. Oh, and also a split die. Even Drucke got into the Bowling Dice Act in 1943 with one of their little travel games in that series. I wished I had that one. In 1945, Pat Maffio had something called Double O Bowling. In 1950, William Bruce Company published Alley Up. And there was Roland Bowl by the Luderus brothers. That was in 1952. That one used 2 dice, an entirely different experience of die rolling for bowling scores. And in 1958, Zing published Easy Bowling Game. That one, curiously, used 20 dice, and they were all very specialized. You see a picture here. It's pretty obvious what the gutter ball and foul result looked like. I looked over the rules. They looked pretty complicated to me. Probably a reason it wasn't a big hit. It wasn't so easy after all. In 1960 was Click Bowling. This was quite a different approach for Click Bowling. It was played on a tiny plastic bowling alley, very short one. It was really not much more than a long tray to roll your dice in. But you'd roll the dice, and that would tell you which pins to take out of the formation of 10 pins. Well, then the second phase of it was a solitaire type of game where you jump the pins to try to eliminate the rest of the pins. Very interesting, if not very much like bowling. You got to give them credit for originality at the very least. E.S. Lowe produced the Bowl and Score game. That was in 1962. They also had a game called Bowl and Strike in the same year. I don't know what the difference between the two really was. But Bowl and Score was the more popular one. It was published later by several other companies, including Milton Bradley. But it pretty much followed the classic spare time bowling formula. There are games that have been published since the year 2000 by Cardinal, Chris Lloyd, Five Below, Fun Decks, Ideal, Poof Slinky, Spin Master, all created different versions of the old spare time dice game. The version from Cardinal says, "All the fun of lane bowling without the gutter balls. And the bowling game you can play anywhere, anytime." One reviewer said, "It's mindless fun. At least you learn how to score." Because everything goes better with zombies, there's also zombie bowling. Hasbro, cashing in again on one of their brands, came out with a Yahtzee bowling game. It was created in conjunction with Wendy's restaurants, and it used these really interesting little bowling pin dice. They had hexagonal faces on them, so you rolled them and the numbers came up on top. I'd love to have some of those little bowling pin dice. Those are pretty cool looking. Not only did Wendy's use it as one of their premiums there, but they also apparently had a TV game show based on it. And the final 2 entries into this video from a company called Scarb, a pair of similar games with quite different themes. There's Raceway Bowling and Dragon Bowling. Here's the idea. You go to the bowling alley. You set this board game up on the table behind the scoring table, and you bowl. And as you bowl and you make your score, that score determines how you move a pawn around on the game board. And then you're trying to play, you're basically playing 2 games at once, one on the bowling alley and one on this game board. According to their website, Dragon Bowl is a fantasy adventure board game with bowling as the driving force. Defeat the dragon and save the kingdom. And get to the bowling center and race to the checkered flag with the Raceway Alley adventure board game. You'll be revving your engine to knock 10 pins into the pit. You know, combining 2 great hobbies, that's fine, but this really sounds like a stretch. I wonder if any of y'all have encountered this one before. I'll give you the link if you want to look. But whether you're in the parlor, at the dining room table, in a bowling alley, or out in the park, whatever you do, be sure to play every day. Strike! Oh, wait, that's something different.